Chicago glittered with lights. But beneath the glamour lay dark corners where crime thrived. In a damp alley near Michigan Avenue, Chris Evans double-checked the handgun hidden under his jacket. His eyes were sharp, every muscle tensed as if preparing for battle. Across from him, Ryan Reynolds leaned against a wall, chewing gum, his eyes glinting with suspicion. They were both gearing up for a major job, robbing a bank to expose Carlos Mendez, a notorious drug lord from Mexico City. But what they didn't know was that they were both undercover agents. Chris with the DEA. Ryan, with naval intelligence, and mistrust was simmering between them. Late at night, a small diner in the bustling Loop district was filled with customers. The smell of sizzling donuts filled the air. But Chris and Ryan weren't there to eat. Chris walked in silently, a lighter in his hand. He glanced at the cash register, where an employee was yawning widely, without a word. He held the lighter up to the fire alarm sensor on the ceiling. The alarm blared, and red lights flashed. Customers screamed in panic, scrambling to escape, knocking trays of donuts onto the floor. The diner staff was bewildered, unsure of what was happening. Ryan stood outside the door, hands in his pockets, a smirk playing on his lips. "Chaos is our best friend," he muttered, then pulled a small spray can from his backpack. He sprayed red paint on the wall, crudely scrawling the words "Big Fire" to add to the drama. Inside, Chris quickly vaulted over the counter and smashed a fire extinguisher to create a smoke screen. Smoke billowed out, enveloping the entire diner. The crowd panicked even more, rushing outside and leaving the diner completely empty. The two left the diner, blending into the chaotic crowd. Ryan glanced at Chris, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Not bad with the arson." "Huh," Chris shrugged, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. "Just a warm-up." They didn't know that this fire was just the first step in a much larger plan to rob a bank in downtown Chicago, where Carlos Mendez was hiding millions in dirty money. But this plan was far from simple. Both had their own motives, and the secret of their true identities was waiting to explode. In the car, Chris drove through the glittering streets of Chicago, the lights from the Willis Tower reflecting off the windshield. Ryan sat beside him, checking a bag full of equipment, ropes, gloves, and a handgun. "Why burn down a diner to rob a bank?" Ryan asked, his tone skeptical. Chris answered curtly, "The fire draws the cops in the other direction. The bank will be less guarded." Ryan nodded, but his eyes clearly showed his distrust. He thought Chris was hiding something. A week earlier, at a rundown hotel on the outskirts of Chicago, Chris had met one of Carlos Mendez's henchmen. The guy, his face covered in scars, took a suitcase from Chris containing hundreds of fake passports. "Is the merchandise clean?" he asked. Chris nodded, his voice cold. "Cleaner than old man Mendez's conscience." The man chuckled and handed Chris a thick envelope, but Chris pushed it back. "I want the white stuff, not cash." The man shrugged. "The product isn't here yet. You'll have to wait." Chris left, filled with frustration. His plan depended on luring Mendez out with a drug bust. But now things were going off track. Meanwhile, Ryan was at a nearby vacant lot, facing a group of Mendez's lackeys. They were playing a game of chicken shooting, burying chickens in the ground with only their heads sticking out, then taking turns shooting at them. But they were clumsy, missing repeatedly, and the chickens were still crowing loudly. Annoyed, Ryan drew his gun. A series of shots rang out, as precise as a machine. The chickens' heads fell one by one. The henchman stared, dumbfounded. "Learn how to hold a gun," Ryan sneered as he walked away. On the way out, Ryan turned to Chris. "Heard Mendez took out a guy named Toro. Cut his head right off. Doesn't that bother you?" Chris shrugged. "He wasn't my friend, but his voice was ice cold. Hiding a secret. Chris wasn't an ordinary smuggler. He was a DEA agent who had been undercover for 3 years to take down Mendez. The bank robbery was his last chance to expose him, but Ryan had his own secrets. And the truth about both of them was about to erupt. The two stopped their car near a checkpoint in Chicago. A police officer waved them over. Chris remained calm. Lavier, Ryan, sitting next to him, winked at the female officer. "Hey there. For you free tonight," the officer frowned. But Ryan just smiled. After some questioning, they were let go. But while Ryan was briefly detained, Chris snuck away to meet his girlfriend, who was also a DEA agent, in a dark apartment. He whispered, "Toro's dead. Don't tell the boss. And tomorrow, the heist begins." She nodded, but there was something strange in her eyes. "In which region are you listening to this story? And what time is it there now? Leave a comment to let me know you're doing well and focused on this story. My dear friend, we will continue right after this." A light rain fell on the dark alleys of Chicago, the neon lights from signs flickering and reflecting on the wet pavement. Chris Evans stood in a hidden corner, his leather jacket soaked, his eyes fixed on a black van parked in front of an abandoned warehouse. He was waiting to meet a henchman of Carlos Mendez, the infamous drug lord from Mexico City. In his hand was a suitcase filled with hundreds of fake passports, the key to getting deeper into Mendez's organization. But in Chris's heart, an undercover DEA agent, every step was a life or death gamble. A few blocks away, Ryan Reynolds moved silently across a rooftop, his body as agile as a panther. He was dressed in black, a handgun concealed under his jacket. Under the dim moonlight, Ryan observed a group of Mendez's henchmen making a delivery in a parking lot. No one knew he was a naval intelligence officer, and he himself didn't know Chris was an ally. Ryan leaped down, landing softly on the ground, then suddenly charged the group of 5 men. A taekwondo spinning kick caught the first guy in the jaw, sending him sprawling. The second man pulled a knife, but Ryan was faster, locking the man's arm with a jiu-jitsu hold and slamming his head to the ground. The remaining 3 rushed forward, but Ryan stepped back, drew his gun, and fired 2 shots into their shoulders, accurate to the millimeter. Still yawning, "Guys," Ryan sneered, dusting off his hands. Meanwhile, Chris entered the warehouse, where a burly man with a long scar on his face was waiting. "Where's the merchandise?" the man asked in a gravelly voice. Chris put the suitcase down, opening it to reveal the passports. "Clean, as promised," Chris said, his voice cold. The man inspected each one, nodding in satisfaction, then pushed a bag of money toward Chris. "Cash," he said. Chris frowned, pushing the bag back. "I want the product, not money. Mendez knows that." The man shrugged. "Product's not ready. Wait, or get lost." Chris clenched his fists, suppressing his anger. He needed the drugs to trap Mendez, but now the plan was faltering. Outside, Ryan had no idea Chris was nearby. He slipped into a dark corner, eavesdropping on the conversation of Mendez's men he had just taken down. One of them whispered about a vault at the Central Chicago Bank. Ryan made a mental note. But suddenly, another man regained consciousness and drew a gun. Ryan reacted in a flash, delivering a high kick to the man's wrist, sending the gun flying. The man charged, but Ryan spun, using a judo throw to take his opponent down, then punched him squarely in the face. "Go back to sleep," Ryan muttered, tying the man's hands. Inside the warehouse, Chris left, his heart heavy. He knew Mendez was playing a cat-and-mouse game. As he stepped outside, He accidentally saw Ryan in the distance. Having just finished with the henchman, Chris narrowed his eyes with suspicion. What's this guy doing here, he wondered. He didn't know Ryan was also tracking Mendez. And this coincidence made Chris think Ryan might be a traitor. He retreated quietly, deciding to keep his distance. On the way back, Chris drove across the Chicago River Bridge, the water shimmering under the lights. He called his DEA boss on a secure line. Mendez didn't deliver the product. I need more time, Chris said, his voice firm. His boss sighed. It's been 3 years. Chris, if there are no results in 2 weeks, you're pulling out. Chris hung up, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He couldn't let all his hard work go to waste. But what he didn't know was that Ryan was also contacting his naval superior, receiving a similar order: take down Mendez or lose everything. That night, Ryan stood on a Chicago skyscraper, looking down at the city. He thought about Chris, someone he felt was not right. If he's playing dirty, I'll handle him myself, Ryan told himself, his hand resting on his gun. But then he remembered the cold efficiency with which Chris had dealt with Mendez's men, and a part of him wondered if Chris was truly the enemy. Meanwhile, Chris returned to his secret apartment in Wicker Park. His girlfriend, Emily, another DEA agent, was waiting. She hugged him, but her eyes were distant. Toro is dead, Chris whispered. Don't report it to the boss. And tomorrow, the bank will be the turning point. Emily nodded, but her hand trembled slightly. Chris didn't notice. But she was hiding a secret even bigger than his own identity. As Chris left, Ryan followed silently. Hidden in the shadows, he saw Chris meet Emily, and his suspicion grew. What game is he playing? Ryan wondered, his hand tightening on a dagger. The two agents, unaware of each other's true identities, were stepping onto a dangerous chessboard where every move could lead to bloodshed. Tension mounted as Ryan decided to confront Chris tomorrow, before the bank heist began. He didn't know that, at that very moment, Carlos Mendez was smiling in his lavish mansion in Mexico City. Knowing that his two pawns were pushing each other into his trap, Chris Evans stood in front of the First National Bank, his eyes scanning the bustling crowd on LaSalle Street. He wore a long coat, concealing a handgun and a dagger. Beside him, Ryan Reynolds pretended to look at his phone, but was actually watching every security guard entering and exiting the bank. They were both planning to rob this bank, where Carlos Mendez hid millions in dirty money. But the suspicion between them was like a ticking time bomb, ready to blow everything apart. Chris walked into the bank. Posing as a customer, he glanced at the security cameras, memorizing the position of each guard. The teller counter was crowded, but he noticed a hidden entrance leading to the basement where Mendez's vault was located. He left the bank, exchanging a look with Ryan. 6 guards, 3 cameras, and a rear exit, Chris whispered. Ryan nodded, but his voice was full of doubt. You sure you're not leading me into a trap? Chris gave a faint smile. If it were a trap, you'd already be 6 feet under. They moved to a coffee shop across from the bank, where Ryan spread out a map of Chicago. We go in at 3 p.m. tomorrow. Last night's fire will keep the cops busy in the loop, Ryan said, pointing to the escape routes. Chris nodded, but his mind was racing. As a DEA agent, he wanted to use the stolen money to trap Mendez. But if Ryan couldn't be trusted, the plan would collapse. He didn't know that Ryan, an undercover naval officer, was thinking the exact same thing. Suddenly, a black SUV sped down the street and stopped in front of the bank. 3 of Mendez's henchmen got out, wearing suits but with weapons clearly visible under their jackets. Chris and Ryan immediately ducked down, avoiding their gaze. They're checking the vault, Chris muttered, "We have to act fast." But before they could leave, one of the men turned back. Looking straight at the coffee shop, Ryan gripped his knife. "Ready." Luckily, the man turned away. But the air grew tense as a violin string. They decided to leave the cafe. But just as they stepped outside, another group of 5 men appeared, blocking their path at the street corner. "Mendez wants to see you," the leader growled, his hand on his gun. Chris glanced at Ryan, signaling with his eyes. Without waiting, Ryan lunged forward, delivering a taekwondo kick to the leader's chest, sending him tumbling. Simultaneously, Chris drew his knife, slashing the arm of a man reaching for his gun, causing it to fall. 2 others charged, but Chris spun, locking one in a jiu-jitsu chokehold and slamming his head against the wall. Ryan fired 2 shots into the last man's legs, ending the fight in less than 30 seconds. "Let's go," Chris said, pulling Ryan into an alley. They jumped into a truck and sped across the Chicago River Bridge. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but Chris weaved through traffic. "You're a good shot, but don't think I trust you," Ryan said coldly. Chris smirked. "Good, because I don't trust you either." The escape turned into a dramatic chase. One of Mendez's cars tailed them, firing at their rear. Ryan leaned out the window, firing back repeatedly, blowing out the enemy's tires. The car flipped over, bursting into flames on the road. They stopped at a vacant lot on the outskirts of Chicago. Chris checked the map, reconfirming the plan. "The bank has a high-level security system, but I know how to disable it," he said. Ryan nodded, but his hand remained firmly on his gun. "If you cross me, I'll take you down myself," Ryan warned. Chris didn't reply, just looked him straight in the eye. The tension between them was as sharp as a blade. That night, Chris snuck into a safe house in Wicker Park and contacted his DEA boss on an encrypted phone. "The bank heist plan is ready. If we get Mendez money, we can nail him," Chris reported. His boss sighed. "Watch your friend. I don't like the way he operates." Chris fell silent, knowing his boss was right. Ryan was too mysterious, and it made him uneasy. Meanwhile, Ryan stood on a bridge overlooking the Chicago River, calling his naval superior. "I've found Mendez's vault, but this Chris guy is trouble. He might be working for Mendez," Ryan said, his voice filled with suspicion. His superior gave the order, "Keep an eye on him. If he betrays you, shoot to kill." Ryan hung up, his hand tightening on his gun. He remembered how Chris had taken down Mendez's men with lethal precision, and a part of him wondered if he was making a mistake. When Chris returned to the apartment, Emily, his girlfriend and fellow DEA agent, was waiting. She hugged him, but her eyes avoided his. "Tomorrow, 3 p.m. we hit the bank. Make sure your team blocks the perimeter," Chris said. Emily nodded, but her hand clutched a knife hidden behind her back. Chris didn't see it, but he sensed something was wrong. In the darkness, Ryan stood outside the door, looking through the window, his hand ready on the trigger. The 2 agents, unaware of each other's true identities, were charging into a deadly game. With Carlos Mendez in Mexico City controlling every move, sirens blared through the stifling Chicago air. The First National Bank on LaSalle Street was plunged into chaos as smoke from a small explosion billowed up from the basement. Chris Evans, face covered by a black mask, dashed through the corridor, a handgun in his grip, his movements as swift as an assassin. Outside, Ryan Reynolds stood guard, his sharp, cold eyes scanning the panicked crowd. The 2 had just initiated a bank heist, targeting a vault containing the dirty money of Carlos Mendez, a drug lord from Mexico City. But the plan was already going sideways, and suspicion between them ignited like a flame. Chris stormed into the vault room, his hands deftly attaching an electronic lock-picking device. A series of beeps echoed, and then the heavy steel door swung open. Inside, stacks of cash were piled high, far exceeding their expectations. Not a few million, but tens of millions of dollars. Mendez hid a whole fortune here, Chris muttered, stuffing money into a duffel bag. Outside, Ryan took down one guard with a jiu-jitsu strike, then shot a second one in the leg to stop them from calling for backup. "Hurry up!" Chris Ryan yelled over the comms. They escaped through a back exit and jumped into a black van. Chris drove, speeding through the narrow streets of Chicago, while Ryan checked the bags of money. "Something's not right," Ryan said, his voice tense. "Where are the cops? You said your team would intercept us." Chris gripped the steering wheel tighter, not answering. He had told Emily, his girlfriend and a fellow DEA agent, to arrange a police cordon for a mock arrest after the heist. But the streets were eerily empty, like a trap. The van stopped in a vacant lot near the Chicago River. Ryan suddenly drew his gun, pointing it straight at Chris. "You're playing dirty, aren't you?" Ryan roared, his eyes bloodshot. "This money belongs to Mendez. But who's to say you won't keep it for yourself?" Chris raised his hands, his voice calm. "Easy, Ryan. If I were going to betray you, you'd already be dead." But Ryan wasn't listening, his finger tightening on the trigger. A shot rang out, grazing Chris's shoulder and drawing blood. Chris lunged forward, unleashing a taekwondo kick that hit Ryan's wrist, sending the gun flying. The two grappled, trading blows like wild animals, until Chris locked Ryan in a jiu-jitsu chokehold, forcing him to the ground. "Listen to me," Chris gasped. "I'm not your enemy." They stopped, gasping for breath, their eyes filled with suspicion. Chris got up, checking his wound. "We need to figure out what's going on," he said. Ryan, still clutching a knife, gave a reluctant nod. But in both their minds, the question hung in the air. Who was the other man? And why did the plan fail? That night, in a rundown Chicago hotel, Chris met Emily. She bandaged his wound, but her gaze was evasive. "Why didn't your team show up?" Chris asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Emily shook her head. "You left too early. We were just a few minutes late." Chris looked deep into her eyes, a sense of unease growing inside him. He told her about the heist, the enormous sum of money, and the plan to use it to trap Mendez. "If we can trace this money back to him, we can put him away," Chris said. Emily nodded, but her hands clenched, as if she were hiding something. Meanwhile, Ryan slipped into a secret naval base on the outskirts of Chicago. He met with his superior, Colonel Harris, via an encrypted screen. The heist was a success, but the take was bigger than expected. Ryan reported, "I think Chris is playing a double game." Harris ordered, "Keep an eye on him. If he's working for Mendez, eliminate him immediately." Ryan nodded, but doubt began to creep into his mind. He recalled how Chris fought during the heist, precise, cold, like a true operative. "Who is he?" Ryan wondered. Suddenly, a noise echoed from outside the door. Ryan drew his gun, moving out like a ghost. 3 of Mendez's assassins burst in, their automatic weapons blazing. Ryan dove to evade the gunfire, delivering a kung fu kick to the first man's chest, then put 2 rounds into the knees of the remaining 2. He launched himself through the window, landing on a rooftop below. blood staining his sleeve. "Mendez knows we're here," Ryan muttered, disappearing into the darkness. At the same time, Chris left the hotel. Feeling he was being followed, he stopped in an alley and drew his dagger. An assassin appeared, his own knife flashing. Chris spun, using a judo throw to slam his opponent to the ground, then plunged his blade into the man's shoulder. "Who sent you?" Chris snarled. The assassin sneered. "Mendez is always one step ahead." Chris knocked him unconscious, but his heart sank. He realized Mendez wasn't just a drug lord, he had a mole, and it could be Emily herself. When Chris returned to his apartment, Ryan was waiting. "Gonema him. We need to talk," Ryan said, his voice cold. Chris nodded, but his hand was poised over his knife. The two stood facing each other, unaware they were allies. While in Mexico City, Carlos Mendez smiled, watching his pawns tear each other apart. The bank heist was just the beginning, and the real trap was yet to be sprung. In a narrow alley near the Zocalo, Chris Evans moved silently, his form melting into the shadows. He wore a black jacket, concealing a gun and a dagger, his eyes as sharp and cold as an assassin's. After the failed bank heist in Chicago, Chris decided to confront the notorious drug lord, Carlos Mendez, head-on in his Mexico City stronghold. He was unaware that Ryan Reynolds, the man he still suspected, was secretly tailing him, carrying secrets of his own. Chris stopped before a lavish mansion surrounded by high walls, its security cameras sweeping relentlessly. This was where Mendez ran his drug empire. He scaled the wall, silently taking down a guard with a jiu-jitsu chop to the neck. Inside the courtyard, 3 of Mendez's henchmen were on patrol. Chris moved like a whirlwind, delivering a taekwondo kick to the first man's chest, then spinning to knock out the second with a kung fu strike. The third drew his gun, but Chris was faster, throwing his dagger and sinking it into the man's shoulder, causing him to collapse with a groan. He slipped into the mansion, his heart pounding, but his movements as precise as a machine. In the vast living room, Carlos Mendez sat in a leather armchair, sipping a glass of wine. He smirked as Chris entered, gun aimed squarely at him. "Brave of you," Mendez said in a low voice, "but you've made the wrong move." Before Chris could reply, 4 assassins emerged from the shadows, their knives and guns ready. Without hesitation, Chris vaulted over a table, unleashing a flurry of kung fu strikes that took down 2 of them in an instant. He grabbed the third, using him as a human shield as the last one opened fire. Bullets flew past as Chris returned fire, hitting his target in the chest. Mendez clapped, his eyes glittering. "Not bad, but you have no idea who you're up against." Meanwhile, on the mansion's rooftop, Ryan Reynolds watched through binoculars. He didn't trust Chris, but the bank heist made him suspect something bigger was at play. Suddenly, a team of Mendez's assassins appeared on the roof, automatic weapons at the ready. Ryan sprang into action, felling the first with a spinning taekwondo kick. He drew 2 handguns, firing in rapid succession and dropping 3 more in a blaze of muzzle flashes, the last one charged with a knife. But Ryan spun, using a judo throw to take him down before breaking his wrist, making the man scream, "Mendez must be paying you guys cheap." Ryan muttered, then climbed down to a window where he saw Chris confronting Mendez. Inside the mansion, Chris had Mendez cornered. "Whose money was in that bank?" he snarled. Mendez laughed. "Not mine. You robbed the wrong person." Before Chris could react, Ryan appeared, his gun aimed at Chris. "Drop your weapon," Ryan said, his voice cold. Chris narrowed his eyes, recognizing Ryan. "What are you doing here?" he asked. His own gun still steady. The air was thick with tension. But then they both heard alarms blare. Mendez's reinforcements were on their way. Chris and Ryan exchanged a look. "We can talk later," Ryan said, turning his gun toward the door. A group of assassins burst in, and the battle erupted. Chris took one down with a high kick, then stabbed another through the shoulder with his dagger. Meanwhile, Ryan fired relentlessly, every bullet finding its mark. They fought in perfect sync, as if they had worked together for years. Yet neither knew the other's true identity. When the last man fell, Mendez was gone, leaving behind only a note. "See you in Chicago?" During their escape, Chris and Ryan jumped into a truck, speeding through the crowded streets of Mexico City. "Who are you?" Ryan asked, his hand still gripping his gun. Chris looked him straight in the eye. "I'm the one who wants to take Mendez down." "And you?" Ryan smirked. "Same." They fell silent. But a flicker of understanding passed between them. They didn't say it, but they both realized the other wasn't the enemy. Chris pulled out his DEA badge and tossed it to Ryan. "Undercover," he said. Ryan looked at the badge, then pulled out his own. "Naval Intelligence," he replied. They both broke out laughing, but the laughter died as police sirens wailed in the distance. They stopped the truck in a vacant lot and checked the money from the bank heist. "This money isn't just Mendez's," Chris said, his voice low. "There's someone bigger behind him." Ryan nodded. "The CIA. I've heard rumors they're protecting him." They both realized they were up against a force far greater than they had anticipated. But before they could continue, Chris received a text from Emily. "Come back to Chicago. Something's happened." He looked at Ryan, knowing the woman he loved could be hiding something. As they prepared to leave, a black car raced toward them, guns blazing. Chris dove aside, shattered the windshield with a kung fu punch, and dragged the driver out. Ryan took down 2 more assailants from a distance, and then they both jumped into the car and sped away. "We're allies. For now at least," Ryan said, reloading his weapon. Chris nodded, but in his heart, suspicion about Emily and Mendez still smoldered. In Mexico City, Carlos Mendez watched from his mansion window and smiled. He knew Chris and Ryan were walking right into a much bigger trap. Rain poured down on Chicago, streaming over the neon-lit streets. Chris Evans sat in a dingy bar on the south side, his gaze heavy. The wound on his shoulder from the bank heist still ached. But what unsettled him more was the distant look in the eyes of Emily, his girlfriend and fellow DEA agent. After their bloody trip to Mexico City, Chris knew she was hiding something. Across from him, Ryan Reynolds sipped a beer, idly running a thumb over his dagger. They had just discovered each other's true identities, an undercover DEA agent and a naval intelligence officer, but the trust between them was as thin as a thread. Chris stared out the window, recalling Carlos Mendez's words in Mexico City, "You robbed the wrong person." The tens of millions of dollars from the bank didn't just belong to Mendez. It was tied to a bigger power, possibly the CIA. He tightened his grip on his glass, trying to fight off the feeling of betrayal. Emily had promised to have the police intercept them after the heist, but no one had shown up. What game is she playing? Chris wondered, his heart heavy. Meanwhile, Ryan received a text from his naval superior, Colonel Harris. "Return to base. We have intel on Mendez." Ryan stood up and clapped Chris on the shoulder. "Let's go." "Buddy, we're not finished with Mendez yet." Chris nodded, but his eyes were glued to his own phone, where a text from Emily had appeared. "Meet me tonight. It's important." A chill ran down his spine. They drove to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago, where Harris said there was a lead on Mendez. But as soon as they stepped inside, Headlights blazed to life, and a team of Mendez's assassins appeared, their automatic weapons firing relentlessly. Chris dove behind some crates, drawing his gun and returning fire, dropping 2 men in an instant. Quick as lightning, Ryan delivered a taekwondo kick to one man's chest, then used a judo chokehold on another, slamming his head into the concrete floor. "These guys don't quit," Ryan yelled, unleashing a volley from his twin pistols that took down 3 more. Chris charged forward, taking down a knife-wielding assassin with a series of kung fu strikes. He vaulted over a metal container and caught the last man in a jiu-jitsu arm lock, snapping his wrist. The sound of the break echoed sharply. But then, a massive explosion rocked the warehouse, a grenade thrown from a distance. Ryan tackled Chris to the floor, and they narrowly escaped the blast, with smoke filling the air. They ran for the back door, jumped into their vehicle, and sped away, leaving a sea of flames behind them. In the car, Ryan panted. "Mendez knew where we'd be. Someone tipped them off." Chris nodded, his thoughts turning to Emily. "I'll find out who," he said, his voice cold. They stopped in a dark parking lot near the Chicago River. Ryan checked his weapons, reloading. "If she sold us out..." "What are you going to do?" Ryan asked, his eyes boring into Chris. Chris was silent, his hand tightening on his knife. "She's my partner. But if she betrayed us, I'll handle it." Ryan smirked. "Good, because I don't forgive traitors." That night, Chris went to Emily's apartment in Wicker Park. She opened the door, her eyes red from crying. "Chris, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to hide this from you. The chief ordered me to keep it secret." Chris gripped her shoulders. "What secret? Who's behind Mendez?" Emily looked down, whispering. "The CIA. They're protecting Mendez for his money. Our boss wanted you to hit the bank for evidence. But they never intended for you to survive." Chris froze, feeling as if the ground had dropped out from beneath him. He loved Emily, but this truth felt like a knife in the gut. At the same time, Ryan slipped into a secret naval base in Chicago. Harris was waiting, his face grim. "Chris is a dangerous variable," Harris said. "He could compromise everything, eliminate him if necessary." Ryan frowned. "He's a DEA agent. We're on the same side." Harris sneered. "You're still green." "Ryan, in this game, no one is an ally forever." Ryan left, his mind in turmoil. He remembered Chris saving him at the warehouse, and for the first time, he wondered if he was making a mistake. Suddenly, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the building. A team of assassins stormed the base. Guns blazing, Ryan dove for cover, then came up and took out the first man with a spinning taekwondo kick. He drew his pistol, firing with deadly accuracy. Another man charged with a knife, but Ryan pivoted, slamming a kung fu strike into his chest that sent him reeling. He leaped through a window, landing on a rooftop, his shirt stained with blood. "Mendez isn't letting up," Ryan muttered, vanishing into the night. Meanwhile, Chris left Emily's apartment with a heavy heart. He knew she was being coerced, but the betrayal still stung. As he stepped into the alley, a black car sped toward him. Chris dodged just in time, shattering the windshield with a kung fu punch and yanking the driver out. The man fired back, but Chris used a jiu-jitsu lock to disarm him, slamming his head into the pavement. "Mendez sends his regards." The assassin groaned before passing out. Chris looked off into the distance, knowing that Carlos Mendez was tightening the noose from Mexico City, but now, with Ryan by his side, he had an unlikely ally and an even bigger enemy lay in wait. Chris Evans and Ryan Reynolds sat in an old van parked on the side of Wabash Avenue, the lights of the skyscrapers reflecting off the windshield. After the bloody battle at the warehouse, they both knew Carlos Mendez was no ordinary drug lord. A greater power, possibly the CIA, was protecting him from Mexico City. Chris gripped the steering wheel, his mind in turmoil over Emily's betrayal. Beside him, Ryan cleaned his handgun, his eyes sharp and cold. "We need to make a big play," Ryan said. "If the CIA is involved, that stolen money is the key." Chris nodded, pulling out a piece of paper. Mendez had left in Mexico City. It had an address in the Loop, a luxury hotel where a CIA official was supposed to meet one of Mendez's men today. "If we catch him, we can expose the whole operation," Chris said. Ryan smirked. "Or we'll both eat lead." They said nothing more, but their unspoken coordination was growing stronger. Though trust was still not absolute, they arrived at the hotel, a magnificent building of gleaming glass. Chris posed as a delivery man and slipped into the lobby, while Ryan climbed to the roof with a sniper rifle. In a high-floor conference room, a man in a suit, known as Mr. Gray, was talking to Mendez's henchman. Chris hid behind a door. "Eavesdropping. The money in the bank is ours." "Mr. Gray said, Mendez is just a puppet." Chris gritted his teeth. The CIA was really behind it all. Suddenly, a team of Mendez's assassins appeared, guns blazing. Chris dove to dodge the bullets, landing a taekwondo kick to one man's chest, then used jiu-jitsu to put another in a chokehold, slamming his head against the wall. He drew his dagger, slashing sideways to take down another attacker. From the roof, Ryan sniped, each bullet hitting an assassin in the head with machine-like precision. "Hurry up," Ryan yelled over the radio. Chris grabbed Mendez's henchman and demanded, "Where did Mr. Gray go?" The man trembled and pointed to the back door. They chased after Mr. Gray, launching into a dramatic pursuit on the streets of Chicago. Chris drove, weaving through traffic, while Ryan leaned out the window and shot at Mr. Gray's tires. The other car flipped and burst into flames on a Chicago river bridge. Chris jumped out and dragged Mr. Gray from the wreckage. "Who's behind Mendez?" Chris roared, a knife to his throat. Mr. Gray sneered, "You can't fight them. The CIA needs Mendez to control the border." Chris knocked him out and turned to Ryan. "We have our proof." But before they could leave, a fleet of black cars appeared, their headlights blinding. Mendez's assassins jumped out, automatic weapons blazing. Ryan landed a kung fu kick on one man, then fired in quick succession, dropping 3 more. Meanwhile, Chris charged into the gunfire, using judo to throw an assassin down before stabbing another in the shoulder. A grenade rolled toward them, and Ryan kicked it away, the explosion rocking the entire street. They leaped into their car and sped across the bridge, leaving a sea of flames behind. They stopped in a vacant lot on the outskirts of Chicago, breathing heavily. Chris checked on Mr. Gray, who was unconscious. "He knows too much," Chris said. Ryan nodded, but his eyes were fixed on Chris. "What about your girlfriend? What does she know?" Chris fell silent, remembering Emily's words. "The boss wants you to rob the bank, but he doesn't want you to survive." He gripped his knife, his heart twisting in pain. "I'm going to confront her," Chris said, his voice cold. That night, Chris went to Emily's apartment. She opened the door, her eyes red and swollen. "Chris, I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "The CIA forced me. They said if I didn't cooperate, they would kill us both." Chris stared deep into her eyes, trying to tell truth from lies. Tell me the truth. Who's behind Mendez? He asked. Emily looked down. A CIA official named Stanson. He's controlling everything from Mexico City. Chris nodded. But in his heart, he knew he couldn't fully trust her. Meanwhile, Ryan slipped into a secret naval base in Chicago. Colonel Harris was waiting. Mr. Gray confessed, the CIA is using Mendez to launder money across the border. Ryan reported. Harris frowned. You and Chris are in too deep. Back off, or you'll be considered a traitor. Ryan tightened his grip on his gun, knowing his own superiors could be part of the game. As Ryan left the base, a sound cut through the silence. An assassin jumped from the shadows, his knife gleaming. Ryan dodged, landed a kung fu punch to the jaw, and then shot him in the leg. Mendez sends his regards. The assassin groaned before collapsing. Ryan disappeared into the night, knowing time was running out. In Mexico City, Carlos Mendez sat in his villa with a sinister smile. He knew Chris and Ryan were closing in, but he had prepared a deadly trap, and this time, there would be no escape. Darkness shrouded an abandoned factory on the outskirts of Mexico City, where rusted machines stood silent like ghosts. Chris Evans and Ryan Reynolds hid behind a crumbling wall, breathing heavily after the long journey from Chicago. They had received a tip from a secret source that Carlos Mendez was meeting his men here, preparing a large drug shipment, but both of them could feel a trap waiting. Chris, his eyes like ice, checked his handgun and the dagger hidden under his jacket. Beside him, Ryan loaded 2 pistols, a forced smirk playing on his lips. If this is a trap, at least we'll go out with a bang. They crept into the factory, their boots scuffing quietly on the concrete floor. Suddenly, headlights flared to life, and a team of Mendez's assassins emerged from all directions, automatic weapons blazing. Chris dove for cover, landing a taekwondo kick to one man's chest that sent him flying. He spun, catching a second man in a jiu-jitsu chokehold and slamming his head into a machine. From above, Ryan leaped off a scaffold, guns blazing from both hands. Taking down 3 men in an instant, another charged him with a knife. But Ryan met him with a kung fu punch to the jaw and twisted his wrist until he screamed, "These guys just don't kit." Ryan muttered. Blood splattered on his shirt. Chris raced down a narrow corridor and discovered a conference room with a large screen. Carlos Mendez appeared on it via video feed, a sinister smile on his face. "Hello, agents. The money you stole in Chicago was never mine. It belongs to more powerful people." Chris gritted his teeth, realizing the scope of the conspiracy. "The CIA," he whispered. Before he could react, a grenade rolled into the room. Ryan kicked it away, and the blast shook the walls, filling the space with thick smoke. They ran for the back exit, only to find another team of assassins waiting. Chris charged forward, unleashing a chain of kung fu strikes that dropped 2 men. Another pulled a gun, but Chris threw his dagger, burying it in the man's shoulder, before using judo to throw another assailant. From a distance, Ryan picked them off with sniper-like precision. They fought in perfect sync, but they were outnumbered. An assassin managed to stab Chris in the arm, drawing blood. He roared in pain and delivered a high kick to his attacker's neck. Finishing him, they leaped into a truck and tore through the dark streets of Mexico City, leaving a blaze in their wake. Inside the truck, Ryan bandaged Chris's arm. "We've been played," Ryan said, his voice strained. "The CIA is using Mendez for money laundering, and now they want us dead." Chris nodded, his eyes glued to the road ahead. He thought of Emily, the woman he once trusted. "She knows too much," Chris said. "I need to confront her." Ryan's lips curled into a sneer. If she sold us out, I'll take care of her myself. They stopped in a vacant lot to check their equipment. A USB drive they'd grabbed from the factory held data on Mendez's transactions with the CIA. This is our proof, Chris said, stashing the drive. But before they could move, a black car screeched toward them. Headlights glaring. An assassin leaped out, knife flashing. Chris dodged, hit him with a kung fu punch to the chest, and locked him in a jiu-jitsu hold. Ryan took down 2 others from afar, but a bullet grazed his shoulder. Mendez doesn't let go. Ryan roared as he jumped back in the truck. They raced to a seedy hotel in Mexico City, where Chris contacted Emily on an encrypted line. "Meet me in Chicago," she said, her voice shaking. "I know who's behind Mendez. His name is Stanson. He's CIA. He wants the money and both of your lives." Chris said nothing, a sharp pain piercing his heart. He loved Emily, but his doubt was overwhelming. "If you're lying, you know what happens," he said, and ended the call. Meanwhile, Ryan met with a secret naval contact in Mexico City. Stanson is the target. The contact told him he's using Mendez to control drugs across the border, but be careful. Chris could be a liability. Ryan frowned. "He's my ally. I've seen how he fights." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. He recalled Chris taking down assassins with lethal precision and wondered what he might be hiding. As Ryan left, a noise cut through the night. An assassin jumped from the shadows, his gun blazing. Ryan dodged the gunfire, landed a taekwondo kick to his chest, and then shot him in the leg. "Who sent you?" Ryan growled. "The assassin," just sneered. "Mendez is always one step ahead." Ryan knocked him unconscious and disappeared into the darkness. In Mexico City, Carlos Mendez sat in his office, watching his security monitors. He knew Chris and Ryan were closing in, but his final trap, a lethal showdown, was set. And this time, he would not let them escape alive. In a dark apartment in Wicker Park, Chris Evans sat on a chair, his heavy gaze fixed on a photo of himself with Emily. His breathing was labored, the wound on his arm still seeping blood from the fight in Mexico City. Emily's betrayal was a knife in his heart. But he couldn't deny that he still had feelings for her. Outside, rain fell endlessly, mingling with the sound of distant sirens. Ryan Reynolds stood by the window checking his gun, his eyes sharp. "We have the USB. We have proof," Ryan said. "But Carlos Mendez is still one step ahead." Chris nodded, his voice deep. "And Stanson, he's the key." They received intel from a secret source. Mendez was running another covert facility in Mexico City, a storage site for his drugs and weapons. Chris and Ryan decided to hit it. Not just to take down Mendez, but also to find Stanson, the CIA official pulling the strings. But a question haunted Chris's mind: was Emily a victim or a traitor? They flew back to Mexico City, landing at a small airstrip under the cover of darkness. They infiltrated an abandoned industrial park where Mendez's base was hidden in an old factory. Chris led the way, a shadow moving through the night, his dagger flashing. He took out a guard with a taekwondo kick, then used jiu-jitsu to choke out a second, slamming his head on the ground. Following behind, Ryan sniped 3 patrolling assassins from afar, each shot perfectly placed. "Taking it easy." "Killer," Ryan quipped, reloading his weapon inside the factory. The air was heavy with the stench of chemicals and gunpowder. Chris found a storeroom packed with enough drugs to supply a whole city, but before they could destroy it, a team of Mendez's assassins appeared, automatic weapons blazing. Chris dove for cover, unleashing a flurry of kung fu strikes that took down 2 men instantly. Another rushed him with a knife, but Chris pivoted, using a judo throw to take him down before driving his dagger into the man's shoulder. From the scaffolding above, Ryan fired shot after shot, dropping 4 more men in a shower of blood. "Don't these guys ever learn?" Ryan yelled as he leaped down. In the midst of the firefight, Chris spotted a control room with a large monitor. Emily was on the screen, tied to a chair, her eyes filled with terror. Mendes stood beside her, a sinister grin on his face. "Agent, you want to save her, come and get her. But bring the USB." Chris gritted his teeth, knowing Emily could be a pawn. But he couldn't leave her. Ryan pulled him back. "It's a trap. Chris. She sold us out." Chris roared back. "She was my partner," but deep down, he knew Ryan might be right. They bolted outside, only to be blocked by a fleet of black cars. Assassins leaped out, guns blazing. Chris took one down with a high kick, then knocked another out with a kung fu strike. Ryan fired relentlessly, each bullet hitting its target. A grenade rolled in, and Chris kicked it clear just as the blast rocked the factory. They jumped into a truck and tore through the narrow streets of Mexico City, with another car in hot pursuit. Ryan leaned out the window and blew out its tires, sending it flipping through the air. They stopped in a vacant lot, gasping for air. Chris looked at Ryan, his voice grave. "If Emily is a spy, I'll deal with her myself. But I have to know the truth." Ryan nodded, his hand gripping his gun. "Good, because if she's playing us, I'm not waiting for you." They checked their equipment, preparing for the final fight. The USB they held was proof against Mendes and Stanson, but now they had to confront them all, including Emily. That night, Chris called Emily on a secure line. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. She whispered back, "Mendes has me. Don't come. It's a trap." But her voice faltered, as if she were hiding something. Chris ended the call, his heart aching. He remembered the time he spent with Emily, but now a wall of suspicion stood between them. At the same time, Ryan met his naval contact in Mexico City. "Stanson is with Mendes." The contact said, "He knows you have the USB. Watch out. Chris could be compromised." Ryan shook his head. "He's not that guy. I've seen him fight." But as he left, an assassin jumped from the darkness, his knife gleaming. Ryan dodged, landed a kung fu punch to the chest, then shot him in the leg. "Mendes sends his regards." The assassin groaned before collapsing. Ryan vanished into the night, knowing time was almost up. In Mexico City, Carlos Mendes sat in his office, staring out the window. He knew Chris and Ryan were on their way, but he had prepared a final trap, a showdown where only one side would walk away. And Emily, the woman Chris loved, could be the sharpest weapon in his arsenal. After days on the run, they had the proof on the USB drive. Mendes and the CIA official, Stanson, were in bed together, laundering money across the border. But the cost of taking them down would be their lives, and possibly Emily's. Chris, his shirt stained with blood, gripped his dagger tightly, his eyes as cold as an assassin's. Beside him, Ryan checked his twin pistols, a smirk masking his concern, ready for the grand finale. "Buddy," Ryan asked. Chris nodded. "We take down Mendes, or we're not going home to Chicago." They crept into the warehouse, their footsteps silent on the concrete. Suddenly, blinding lights flared on, revealing Carlos Mendes on a raised platform, a gun in his hand, and Emily tied up at his side. "Welcome, agents," Mendes sneered. "The money belongs to the CIA, not me. But now, you're going to die for it." Behind him, Stanson stepped into the light, his eyes cold as ice. A team of assassins surrounded them, their automatic weapons raised and ready. Chris and Ryan exchanged a look, then sprang into action. Chris unleashed a taekwondo kick, taking down one goon, then used jiu-jitsu to lock the second in a chokehold, slamming his head to the ground. Ryan fired in rapid succession, each bullet finding its mark, felling 3 men in the blink of an eye. A man charged with a knife, but Ryan spun, landing a kung fu punch to his chest, then snapped his wrist. Smoke and fire erupted as a grenade exploded, shaking the warehouse. Chris leaped over the debris, plunging a dagger into an assassin's shoulder, then shot down 2 more. But Mendez activated a device on the platform. A digital clock appeared, counting down from 12 seconds. In 12 seconds, this place will be wiped off the map, Mendez laughed, pointing his gun at Emily. Chris stood still, his eyes locked on Mendez without flinching. 12, 11. Mendez taunted, scared now agent. But Chris just smiled, his eyes as cold as a wolf's. 10, 9. He watched Mendez's every move, from the way he gripped his gun to his ragged breathing. 7, 6. Ryan yelled, "Chris, do something." But Chris remained calm, as if time had stopped. 5, 4. Suddenly he lunged forward like a whirlwind, landing a spinning taekwondo kick on Mendez's wrist, sending the gun flying. 3, 2. Chris leaped onto the platform, delivering a rapid series of kung fu punches to Mendez's chest, then locked him in a jiu-jitsu chokehold, forcing him to his knees. 1. He fired a shot into Mendez's leg, making him scream while simultaneously kicking over the bomb device, disabling it just as the 0 flashed. Ryan, meanwhile, confronted Stanson. He drew his gun, but Ryan was faster, firing 2 shots into his shoulder, making Stanson fall. "The CIA's time is up," Ryan said, kicking Stanson's gun away. Chris turned to Emily, cutting her ropes. She hugged him, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Chris. I was forced." But Chris pushed her away, his voice cold. Later, he pulled her into a run with Ryan as the remaining team of assassins charged. They rushed outside and jumped into a truck. Chris drove speeding through the narrow streets of Mexico City with Mendez's car in pursuit. Ryan leaned out the window and shot out the enemy's tires, causing it to flip over. A helicopter appeared, firing from above. Ryan aimed his sniper rifle and took down the pilot with a single shot, sending the helicopter crashing down in a ball of fire. "Nice shot," Chris laughed, the first time the two of them were truly in sync. They stopped the truck in a vacant lot and checked the USB. The evidence on Mendez and Stanson was enough to bring down an entire corrupt network, but Chris looked at Emily, his heart still heavy. "Whose side were you on?" he asked. She lowered her head. "I wanted to save you, but I made a mistake." Ryan clapped Chris on the shoulder. "She's your problem. But we took down Mendez. Time to go back to Chicago." Chris nodded, throwing his DEA badge to the ground. "I'm done with this game," he said, but his eyes still burned with fire. They left Mexico City, leaving a fallen empire in their wake. Carlos Mendez bound and captured by the Mexican police, Stanson wounded, facing the courts. Chris and Ryan walked into the dawn, 2 unlikely friends, now bound by blood and fire. Chris turned to Ryan. "Thanks for not shooting me." Ryan smiled. "No promises for next time." They shook hands and walked into the shadows, ready for new battles.